Hi there, welcome to this week's Pascal's China Lens. I personally believe that we're entering a new era of AI. A new era where I feel China is going to lead the world, and this is going to take just a couple of years from now, that the US and Europe will not be able to catch up anymore. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, can we trust China as becoming the #1 AI superpower in the world? If you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so. I would truly appreciate it. Also want to announce that next week my book will be available in Dutch and in a couple of weeks from now in English, so you can pre-order it online, pascalcoppens.com or canwetrustchina.com, where you'll see a lot of information if you're interested on whether we can trust China or not and how to get a different view on this country in transition. What do you think? Do you believe we should trust China as an AI superpower? Well, that was the question that was asked to me just a couple of days ago. I made a presentation on the 18th of March at the European AI Week. As an expert in that field on China, I was asked for 1 hour to talk about AI in China and whether we should trust China when it comes to becoming that AI superpower. So very interesting presentation that I made, and I want to share some of these findings that I shared at that point. Now, in 2019, I came out with my book, China's New Normal, which is all about setting the standard for innovation from China. And what I describe in that book, and it's still very real today, is that by 2030, China will become the leader in AI. And I've described that in 10 different industries, how they're applying that in every single industry and are actually becoming an AI superpower. 2016, Xi Jinping already said that by 2030, China would become the leader in innovation, and AI was central to that. Even in the 13th five-year plan, it was very much written down that for the next 5 years, from 2016 to 2020, it was all about promoting the integration of the internet, about big data, about AI, and of course these three things combined, but the most important is to apply that into the real economy. And this was 5 years that China really focused on applying artificial intelligence for real. And this is not just only about research, it's really about making it usable and adopted within society. And they've been very successful at it. One of the drivers and starting points of it was, of course, in 2017, where Beijing said, we're going to make a next generation AI plan. And they did. And then soon after, it came the 3-year action plan. And you know, when Beijing says this is what we need to do, they have a step-by-step approach. And lots of companies feel there's funding, there's opportunity, we need to go there. And so that's what happened. In Europe, it took us a year longer before we really got our act together. Same in America. But this was really the guidance. But what really happened at that point is that China in 2016 decided that disruptive technologies would change everything. And this is something going from top down, but also the companies, the Tencents, the Alibabas, the Baidus, all these companies really understood that all of these disruptive technologies could change their company and change China as a whole. The big difference with the West is that most of the tech companies, even the big ones, they were looking at these disruptive technologies much more as a transformation. The big ones did more research, but all the others mainly were looking at it the next step. We're going to digital, and now we're going to AI, and then we're going to blockchain. And so this was like a step-by-step approach. It wasn't a must-have, it wasn't a disruption. And for China, early on they understood, only if we're going to put that central to our strategy, we will be able to catch up with the rest of the world, specifically the West. And artificial intelligence was central to that. And so that's why it became so quickly a superpower on AI. Now, the big difference is also how it evolved. And if you look at the evolvement of AI, what you see is a few things that are very different from the West. To start with, it started about 10 years ago, 2012, but at that point, China was not disappointed just like the West was when it comes to artificial intelligence. Because for us in the West, in America and Europe, we had like decades of experimenting, having really high expectations on artificial intelligence. and then seeing, well, the flying cars are not going to happen. And so people got disappointed, were worried, they were worried about their jobs. So a lot of fear that AI wouldn't solve the problems that we wanted them to solve. After many decades, I mean, the energy was lost a little bit. While in China, from 2012, 2013 onwards, startups were really trying to figure out how to position this into society, much more than the big companies in the West. So in the West, we had the big tech companies doing it. In China, it was more the startups. And they were really very pragmatic and practical and trying out everything from face recognition, voice recognition, I mean, all these things, and see, can we make this, can we make that, robots, whatever, in the factories. Just experimenting. This was a big lab, and they had no expectation. They didn't know where to end up. Well, in Western companies, it was a strategy. They knew exactly where they wanted to end up, and they put funding into it. And so that experimentation created a real upbeat on AI, because every time they felt this is working out, the recommendation engine, we can get more customers, I mean, it became a big thing. And it's only after 2016-17, when the government really pushed for AI, that the big tech were focusing on it. The Alibabas, Tencents, Baidus, and so on. Baidu was one of the first ones with their AI, also now for self-driving cars, and before it was all about their algorithms for language, NLP. And then what you see is then you suddenly got that all coming together. The startups, the big tech, the government giving funding, you saw venture capitalists, and this going specifically in B2B, where the government was often the customer of these big companies. And suddenly it was all coming together and AI became a strategy. And so this is only 5 years old. But just 10 years ago, when China really started the early steps in AI, the whole West was convinced that it would take China at least 20 years to start becoming innovative. But 8 years later, we were already talking about this AI technology supremacy race between China and the US. And why didn't we see this coming? I mean, how come we thought it was going to take maybe 50 years before China could actually become a threat on AI and other technologies, and now suddenly in 8 years they've achieved it? And the answer is actually pretty simple. The answer has everything to do with the fact that they adopted it. And Eric Schmidt, the chairman of the National Security Commission in the US, which used to be the CEO of Google, said very clearly that we now have to watch, and this is 2021, we have to watch China, because what they did in the last 5 years is just incredible. This has everything to do with putting it into society. AI in China is a must-have. It's not a nice-to-have. For us in the West, most companies, and I've been at the AI week in Europe just now, I mean, there's lots of great things happening, but still for most of the companies, and we're talking about 2/3 of all the companies in Belgium, for example, they still see AI as a nice-to-have, not a must-have. In China, most tech companies see it as a must-have. And the result is that in every industry, whether it's in healthcare or in fintech, in mobility, in travel, in agriculture, in logistics, in factories, every industry, there's now global leaders. Think about E2 or SenseTime. Think about Ant Financial or Ant Group with the fintech. Think about Didi with their recommendation or their prediction algorithms. Ctrip with their chatbots and stuff like that. You have Ping An, the insurance company, the biggest in the world, doing things with agriculture to predict if animals are sick or not with face recognition. Alibaba does the same, maybe with cows and so on. So everybody does his thing. But the interesting thing is they've all become the leaders in their field. Huge companies where AI is at the center of what they want to do. And this is something we don't see as often in the West. I mean, of course, in America, Google is very much into AI and IBM and Microsoft. I mean, they're really big AI houses. But industry-wise, you see China going much deeper and much faster. Now, what's also interesting is that in this 5-year plan that started in 2021, the 14th 5-year plan, China isn't talking anymore about promotion of AI. Now it's about nurturing. And the reason they're talking about nurturing, and it's not just AI, it's combined with cloud and blockchain and 5G, and so we'll talk about that in a minute, but it's about nurturing, which means they feel society already has it. Many of these AI algorithms are open, there's AI experts, and so they have the foundation. Now it's just about getting better and better and better at it. And that is what's happening and will happen in the next years to come. What's interesting is that in this 14-year plan, they're really talking about the integration of stuff like IoT and AI, of course 5G. It's about going deeper in research, which they've been behind before. It's also about innovation hubs and figuring out the infrastructure. But then I think the most important, China is now on a path to actually have an AI for good or AI ethics that they want to establish. It's about standardization, it's about protection, it's about regulation. We've seen all of that just last year with all the regulations in the fintech. We've seen the regulations in the monopoly laws, in privacy laws, in national security laws. Well, AI is part of that. And actually the AI algorithms today, the recommendation engines, is one of the things part of the privacy law, which means that consumers have to consent if they want these algorithms to be used against them or not, or for them. And so this is going very, very far, and is very far forward looking in China. What's interesting now is that China has been building over the past years great AI ecosystems. One of the things they've been doing very well, better than the West, is actually gathering contextual data. I mean, we have a lot of data in the West too, like Facebook and Amazon, they have huge data. But one of the differences is that we usually stick within one industry. That means we have data on, for example, Amazon, on books and everything you buy online. But Amazon doesn't have data on many other industries like agriculture or maybe on things like travel. I mean, they don't have that same data. But in China, with the super apps, WeChat, Alipay and so on, they have all that contextual data. And that's very interesting because it can tell you what the consumer is doing, and so you can refine your algorithms. And then there's the infrastructure that has been building for a long time. I mean, before it was all about hubs and about research labs, and it was all about going into schools and teaching about AI, and this is all great. But now these days, it's about implementing AI as a strategy within government services and any service that consumers or users or citizens would need. And so you see big cities like Shenzhen becoming a complete AI hub. But you see also, for example, in the law, in the court, AI prosecutors coming up, where 97% of all the lawsuits are prosecuted with an engine, with an AI algorithm, and then the lawyer or the judge just needs to verify, is this correct or not, because most of these things are similar, because we're creatures of habit. And so this is really starting to create a smart city environment where AI is central. And this is going to be very interesting. Of course, talent is a big challenge. I mean, China has more engineers coming out of university than any country in the world. There's about 37% of the whole world every year graduating. We're talking about almost 5 million STEM graduates. So there's a lot of people now going into artificial intelligence. Young kids learn it. I mean, that's all great. But they're still behind very often, and they have to catch up with some of the smartest people in the West when it comes to AI. But give it a number of years and we'll see real miracles happening. That's my feeling, at least. Because they have their mind on it, and they're smart people everywhere. What you also saw in 2021 is a lot of regulations and rules happening in all these industries, and AI is part of it. The big bottleneck for China is chips. And I've made another video about that a couple of weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, and it's clear that China is actually behind when it comes to building chips. It has to do with the machinery that they don't always have, but also building a fab like SMIC has one, it has many actually. It's not so easy, it's costly, and it takes like 10-20 years, like TSMC has been doing very well in Taiwan. And so the difference is that China is catching up there. But when it comes to AI chips, actually, there's very few tech companies, large tech companies like Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, Xiaomi, ByteDance from TikTok, all these companies, there's very few of them today that are not designing their own AI chips. And they're starting to fabricate it as well with SMIC and with others, and so HiSilicon and so on. And so you will see in a couple of years from now that China will probably not be dependent on the US anymore when it comes to purely AI chips. For the others, it might be still a challenge, specifically going to the lower nanometers for cell phones and smartwatches and so on. But for AI chips, I mean, a lot's going to happen. This is starting a new era of AI, and I think it's really cool. I'm really excited about what's happening now because you're starting to see everything come together. I mean, data and AI, China starts to become the leader, to become a smart society. I mean, America is starting to be behind, and so we in the West, we need to be careful there. But what's really leapfrogging into the future is that connectivity. Today with 5G, I mean, I don't need to talk about how advanced 5G is from China, specifically the implementation of it in society. I mean, it's available almost everywhere, and there's 500 million accounts already on 5G. So by the end of this year, there's going to be 2 million 5G base stations implemented in China. So everything's connected. The most connected place on the planet on that scale. Cloud is same like Alibaba Cloud, Tencent Cloud, same as like Amazon, Microsoft. So there's very similarities, but 5G is really a couple of years ahead. And this is now all moving to the edge, moving to the sensors, what it means IoT, Internet of Things, where the computing of the algorithms, the AI algorithms, are happening everywhere, not just in a central cloud-based environment. And that's very interesting because now you suddenly have a decentralized system. And a decentralized system really allows to compute much more, and specifically when we think about ecology and stuff like that, it's actually an advantage. Then you have robotics, very interesting to watch as well as an industry, because China has more industrial robots today than America, than South Korea, Japan and Germany together. I mean, not all of them are operational, but there's a huge investment in automated factories, in automated industries and logistics into the Chinese environment. Add that to 5G, add that to this IoT, add that to the whole thing about data and AI, and you're getting the smartest, connected, interconnected environment in the world. So China is becoming the biggest lab to make everything automated and directed. And of course, then you need trust. And that's where blockchain is coming in. With the biggest blockchain network in the world that China has been building, I mean, this is going to be, or has to become, the most trusted place on the planet when it comes to sending data around and verifying things. And then, of course, you need ethics, because otherwise AI could be used for bad and for evil and not for good. And so China needs to focus on that too. What I've seen is that over the past, I would say 10 years, since 2012, 2011, there's been a huge progress. This has all been about digitalization, and that has helped to create more data in society. Now that the data is there, since 2016, every company is now becoming an AI company in China, or tech companies are, becoming an AI superpower. And what's happening now from today on is that China is now looking for purpose. And this is where this ethic and AI for good is coming in. And so, because if you're very powerful, you need to be also responsible and accountable. And so, is China doing a great job there? That's the question many people doubt, and something to answer. And this is becoming a war, an AI war on values. It's quite interesting, the words we are using into the AI ethics, because very often it says like, yeah, in the West we have universal values, and in China it's relative, it's traditional values. It's not the same as the liberal values that we have in the West. But is that really a fact? And are values universal? Because aren't all values based on culture in some fashion? And so if we look at the universal values that we talk about in the West very often, about freedom and privacy and fairness and diversity and justice, transparency, all these things, which of course, as a Westerner myself, I value a lot as an individual. And so we are told in the West, and I completely agree with that we should treat every individual according to these universal values. And so this is very important for me as a Westerner as well, and for, I think, most of the Westerners. So we will fight for it to keep our values alive. And then we look at China and we're wondering, do they have the same values? And many people say no, but actually I disagree. If you look at China, they have pretty much the same values, because it's also a culture of 2,500 years that has these values inside. But one of the big differences may be that it's been looked at more from a collective than from an individualistic point of view. What I mean by that is that in China, it's more important to actually know how to behave towards the collective and the society than actually us telling what to do with the individual. So instead of an outside in, it's an inside out reflection. This is really about self-discipline and about social responsibility and a lot of things about community focus. China really wants people to understand what they have to do to be good. And so we have the same values, but it's a different way of looking at it very often. And so I believe this is the reason why I don't see the AI ethics in China and AI ethics in the West being so different in itself. But there might be a different lens of how to look at it. Specifically, if we look at Confucianistic or Confucian values, what we see, this has a lot to do with things like harmony and peace and respect and modesty. I mean, Confucius was talking about this 2,500 years ago. Still, Xi Jinping and many people are talking about this today. We often say, yeah, these are kind of hollow words and win-win, and what does it really mean? But this is pretty deep, and this is about morals and ethics that Chinese have had for 2,500 years, that they understood this is how I need to behave within society. What it means, it's not about how we treat individuals, it's more about how you treat your collective, how you treat the people around you, the people you trust, the people you know, your network, your society. And so it's the same thing. It's just often a different view. But if you then look at the AI ethics that, for example, in the left in China are being built, are being created, and in Europe, where we also spend a lot of time on building great AI ethics, we see the exact same things. But we're using a little bit different words. And the things like harmony and tolerance and justice and respect, these things, they show up in the Chinese side, but they're actually meaning the exact same thing pretty much. So we all talk about fairness, we talk about safety, we talk about things like privacy, robustness, transparency. In the end, we're all humans and we all want to do the same thing. So AI for good, AI ethics in China, in Europe, it's pretty similar. But we shouldn't underestimate the difference of the focus. And the big difference, in my view, how I experience it, when I look in detail at all these plans, is that in the West, it's much more about protecting the individual, while in China, it looks more like giving the opportunity of the community, the collective, to progress. And this actually is a little bit the difference. So we're saying almost the same thing, but we have a little bit different priorities. And so we are more caring about the individual very often. China is more caring about the collective. But both are important. And so what I would say, if I would summarize that simply, is that AI ethics in China is more about doing the right way. And this goes back to Confucianism. What is it the right way to actually behave and treat your environment? And the aim is to be as fair as possible for as many people as possible, for all if possible. That also means that maybe there's a few people that are not treated correctly because they are actually harming the collective. On the other hand, in the West, it's much more about the only way that we should treat the individual. And that's how I, as a Westerner, I appreciate and I understand it. And this is really about, it has to be fair for each and every one of us. Now, there's many exceptions and there's double standards everywhere. And so I do believe we're both saying the same thing. It's just rhetoric a little bit. But the feeling of the collective is much stronger in China than it is in the West when it comes to ethics. And so if you just look from 2017, when China really started building this AI ethics plan, every single month they were gathering together, the government, was the academics, of course the industry, but also civil society. I mean, anybody that is giving a civil society service, but also people were surveyed. So many people get surveyed. And so the Ministry of Science and Technology in 2019 came out with some governance principles for a new generation AI. These were guidelines, like how should we do it? And that's the guidelines I just showed before. This was really about harmony and fairness and stuff like that. But because we are all human and we all have the same values, ultimately, the code that we're writing about ethics is becoming very similar. And so if you look in September, just last year, China came out, Beijing came out with a new generation AI ethics code, and I'll put the link under in the description, so you can actually look at the whole description of the AI intelligence ethic code. And so what you see there is that it's very similar to what we have in Europe, what we're building in Europe. There's not much difference. So we want to do the same thing as China does and be good for society and protect it. Ultimately, what we're doing is we're creating a parallel world. Europe and America, specifically if I look at Europe and I look at China, we're building the same AI protection, AI progress AI world. And this has everything to do with balancing the progress we want people to make thanks to AI for society and for individuals. I mean, we want people to benefit from AI, but at the same time we need to protect the people and definitely protect the nation or the society, because AI can be used against us from a military point of view. And so we're both looking, whether it's the West, Europe, America or China, we're looking at the same parameters and trying to balance the same thing. And so it's no surprise that this code is very, very similar. But there is a little difference in focus, and the difference is a little bit on priorities. If you look at China, it's very close to Europe, and the whole code is built very similarly, or this whole regulation that they're building is very clear one about the other. And it's not that China just copied it, although they probably took a lot from the EU discussions. But the reality is that this is focused a little bit more on the progress of society. This is just collective thinking. While in Europe, we're focusing a little bit more on protecting of individuals. 90% of the time, we're probably saying the same thing if I look at this description, but there is some differences, and that is not unimportant. But I do believe that Europe and China should trust each other into becoming an AI superpower, each of them, because we're actually saying the same thing. When it comes to the US, it's a little bit different. In the US, the regulation is very different at this stage and not as far as in Europe. And what you do see is that it's a lot more about helping people and individuals to progress. And that is, of course, for people to actually benefit, like the recommendation engines and so on. I mean, it's about getting healthcare better and so on. But it's also for protecting the big companies and ultimately to protect the society. And so this is about protecting the nation. And so you feel that US is a little bit more focused on these other things. And therefore I believe that AI superpowers, US and China becoming the two biggest ones, will have more challenges with trusting each other than Europe and China would have. But that is just a reality. Now, the good thing is that we all are putting our focus and attention on AI ethics because we want to be trusted as an AI superpower, whether it's Europe, America, or China. And so we should collaborate together. Unfortunately, that's not happening enough. And so can we trust China on becoming an AI superpower is really about, do we want to create these parallel worlds? Or do we want to work together to create one big world? And that question, in the current environment of what's happening in the world today, is probably going to be a big question to answer over the next weeks, months, and years to come.